So it turns out that Charles Oliveira was fighting Michael Chandler, fighting the referee, and fighting injuries, and still pulled off the first 5-round decision of his career. Charles was so badly injured that he was advised not to fight and set out for 4 to 6 weeks because of torn ligaments in his knee. But he still pulled through because he wants that title fight and instead focused on weight training, so that's interesting. Well, that explains why Charles looks so much bigger than Chandler in there, because Chandler's a big lightweight. He's wide and stocky, and it looked like Charles added like 5 to 10 pounds of muscle on him. And it definitely helped him with his wrestling. I was very surprised to see how easily he got those takedowns on Chandler, but now knowing that he focused his training camp on weight training, then it all made sense. Like, oh, okay, yeah, this guy just got so much stronger for this fight. Toppling over Chandler with those takedowns was kind of crazy, but now it's understandable. And if Charles is going to be that big for his future fights, that is going to be very interesting in how he goes up against these other lightweights, man. If he's physically overpowering these guys now, while also having the knockout power and the submission ability at all times, one of the best finishers in the UFC, Charles is going to be a monster for these guys to fight, man. Imagine fighting Charles, who's that strong, the guy that could take you down, knock you out, or submit you at any point in the fight. It's such a dangerous opponent to go up against. That's the biggest thing people are missing out about Charles Oliveira's performance, man. This may be the best Charles Oliveira we've ever seen. He came out with a heavy wrestling game plan, which is something he doesn't normally do. The last time we saw him fight that way was against Tony Ferguson, right? Against Tony, he was wrestling a lot. But to do that against a wrestler like Michael Chandler was questionable going into it, but worked out very well after seeing the fight. You would think that torn ligaments in the knee would prevent him from wrestling as well as he did, but if he got the fight to the ground, he wouldn't have to worry about maybe stepping wrong, maybe his knee blowing out, something like that, you know? And it goes to explain the quote-unquote lackluster performance. A lot of people were saying that he looked boring and, you know, it wasn't an exciting fight. They hope Charles never fights like that again. I saw a lot of criticism about Charles Oliveira's performance. I thought Oliveira looked amazing in that fight. And I think that has to do with the fact that Charles is always exciting. He's always going for the finish. He's always in these wars with his opponent. The time that he fights patient and intelligent, more intelligent, right? I don't want to make it seem like he's not a smart fighter. Of course he is, but he fought even more intelligent than ever before. The contrast is just so different, right? He doesn't normally fight this way. I thought it was still exciting in normal standards. We just didn't get vintage, war-minded Charles Oliveira in there. Well, he went out there and fought a completely different way that I thought was both exciting and highly skilled. Not only in the wrestling and grappling, but in the striking as well. Oliveira looked amazing in my opinion. I'm going to break it down all the techniques of Charles Oliveira and how skilled this guy was in there. But this is what Charles Oliveira said after the fight. Quote, "I didn't want to talk about it because if we lose, it's taken as an excuse. If we win, we value it. But I had a knee injury. I tore or burst 2 ligaments. I was supposed to be out of action for 4 to 6 weeks, but I didn't want to pull out of this fight at all because I knew that if I won, I could fight for the title again. I had to go to physiotherapy every day, try to train with the pain, but I spent practically 15 to 20 days without training properly. I just really focused on weight training, which was the only thing I could do, but God blessed me enormously and everything worked out." Unquote. Do you know how big of a risk that was for him? Because it wasn't like he was going up against Dan Hooker or another, top 5 opponent. He was going up against Michael Chandler, who was ranked number 8, only has 2 wins in the UFC. Beating Chandler wouldn't be as big as beating a top 5 opponent, right? But he still treated the fight as if it was, right? He still treated beating Chandler as a sure shot to a title, which I think it is. I think Charles Oliveira deserves a next title shot after Arman. And Charles Oliveira also mentioned it as well. He said he only wants to fight for the belt. That's it. And the way that he fought resembles that mentality. This is what Charles Oliveira said, quote, "For sure, I want to be a champion. Everybody knows this. I'm just going to take a couple days off. Since the boss told you guys he'll come pick me up, I'll be right there. I'm not looking for any of them. I'm looking for that belt. Whoever's got that belt, that's who I want. This is MMA. I think all you want to do is win. It only shows how much I evolved and how much I got better. Old Charles or Charles from before would have tightened up a couple grips there and wasted energy or would have exploded a little bit to get out of certain positions. All I want to do is win," unquote. In my opinion, as well as Oliveira's, this is a much better Charles than we've ever seen before. The old Charles probably is a more dangerous fighter, but not as technical overall or as well-rounded. And not only that, Charles is happy with his performance. He was happy with the way he fought Chandler, and he sees the growth in his skills. I'm telling you guys, man, I think this Charles Oliveira would do better against Islam than he did in the first fight, and maybe better against Arman, it depends. fighters. But whether, Islam would entertain fighting Charles again is up to Islam, right? Not saying that Islam wouldn't want to fight him, but he's already done that. Islam's been talking about going up to another weight class. So I understand if he doesn't care to fight Charles Oliveira again, but that would be the last fight in Islam's career at lightweight that would excite the fans. There's no other fight out there, right? He already beat Dan Hooker. He already beat Dustin. He already beat Armin, and he might beat him again. He beat Charles already. The only other fighter coming up that could make sense if he gets a couple wins is Max Holloway, and Max was talking about fighting Charles. Charles is saying that he wants a title fight. Could he mean BMF, right? BMF is also a title. He'd get pay-per-view points. Or does he just want the lightweight title? Because the thing is, dude, Charles is 35 years old. Been through wars, man. Knocked out and knocked down many times throughout his career. And bro took a beating in that 5th round, took a bajillion back of the head shots, which the referee allowed. Rarely in a Charles Oliveira fight, he comes out unscathed. Besides Beneil Dariush and I guess Armin, he wasn't really hurt in the Armin fight. Those are like the 2 fights where Charles didn't get hurt fighting the top contenders. But against Michael Chandler both times, Islam dropped him. Justin Gaethje dropped him twice. Even though the second knockdown was him like falling into his guard, Dustin dropped him. Tony was technically a top contender. He was on the decline from the Justin Gaethje fight, so technically, Charles didn't get hurt in that fight either. But against Chandler, Dustin, Justin, Islam, Beneil, this guy's taking so much damage in those fights, let alone looking back at the Paul Felder TKO, the Cub Swanson knockout, the Donald Cerrone TKO, David Tamer dropped him, like too much damage on his chin while being 35 years old. I don't think he would care to fight for the BMF title until he fights for the lightweight title again. If he loses against Islam, then he'll probably entertain the BMF title. Because let's be honest about the BMF title, man. It's made for the fighters who aren't actual champions, right? There's no champion of any division that was also the BMF champion at the same time. Every single BMF champ has not only lost their next fight, they eventually got knocked out by their next opponent, technically, right? When Jorge Masvidal became the first BMF champ, he lost to Kamaru Usman, then got knocked out by him after. The same guy. Justin Gaethje fought Dustin Poirier for the BMF title. He won the belt, and then got knocked out by Max Holloway. Max Holloway became the BMF champ, lost his next fight to Ilia Topuria, and got knocked out in that fight too. There is a BMF champion curse. And the thing is, Max still holds the belt. And I don't want to see Max get knocked out for a second time in his career back to back, because so far it's happened to every BMF champ who's held that belt. And now that it looks like Charles, at least deservingly, should be fighting for the lightweight title, I don't know who Max Holloway would fight next. He could, maybe Michael Chandler going up against Max, or he could do a rematch with Dustin. Those seem like the most logical matchups for the BMF title. But for Charles, man, I don't think it's worth his time right now fighting for the BMF instead of the lightweight title. If he loses to Islam again, then fight for the BMF. But who do I think would win, Islam or Charles? I think Islam would still win. I don't think there's any fighter that could beat Islam in the lightweight division. There's barely any welterweights that could beat Islam. So what a performance by Charles Oliveira. I'm going to break down the techniques he showed in that fight, because a lot of people are missing how good Charles actually looked in that fight. And not just him being patient, but all the techniques, all the skill. He was so much better in a few areas of his game and could give future opponents a really hard fight. He's more well-rounded than he's ever been in his career. And the guy didn't even have an optimal training camp for this fight too, and he still looked that good. And Oliveira makes a very good point when he says the old Charles would have probably exploded in those positions. Maybe he would have went for submissions all over the place when he was on top of Chandler and lose those positions. Chandler get on top of him and landing ground and pound. As we've seen many times, Chandler's a very hard fighter to submit. He survived 2 fights with Charles Oliveira on his back. Nobody survives with Charles on their back. Even Dustin got submitted. Not only would an old Charles probably would have exploded for submissions and lose his positions on the ground, he might not have went for takedowns, putting himself in risk of getting knocked out in the stand-up. And he used to not strike as patient as he did, running himself into the fire with Chandler waiting for Charles to exchange with him. You saw that throughout the entire fight. Michael Chandler was waiting for Charles to explode so he could land those haymakers. A dominant 5-round decision against Michael Chandler, I believe, is better than him losing the first round, getting dropped, and then winning the second round by TKO. So being patient with wrestling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and striking was the way for Oliveira to get the best kind of win he got, in my opinion.